In the late summer of 1939, the Atlantic Ocean was a landscape of surreal contradictions. On the surface, the great luxury liners of the era, vast, floating palaces of Art Deco mirrors, mahogany paneling, and velvet upholstery, continued their stately processions between New York, Southampton, and Le Havre. To the wealthy passengers dining on caviar in the first-class saloons, the world seemed as stable as it had ever been. But beneath the floorboards, in the radio rooms, in the locked safes of the captain's quarters, a different reality was taking shape. While the public saw the grandeur of the golden age of travel, the British Admiralty was looking at these vessels through a much colder, more utilitarian lens. They didn't see masterpieces of engineering. They saw tonnage. They saw deck space for 6-inch guns. And, most importantly, they saw a liability that had to be managed before the first shot was even fired. By the end of that year, 12 of these legendary vessels would be at the bottom of the ocean. Some were claimed by the enemy, but others met their end under circumstances that remain a subject of intense archival debate. They didn't sink with thousands of screaming passengers or holds full of precious cargo. They sank empty, silent, and far from the headlines. To understand why, one has to look past the official casualty lists and into the secret orders for merchant shipping issued in the final weeks of peace. Records suggest that as early as 1937, the Admiralty had begun a clandestine survey of every major British liner. They weren't looking at engine efficiency for commercial routes. They were measuring the thickness of steel plates and the structural integrity of the promenade decks. The plan was known as the Defensive Armed Merchant Ship Program, or DAMS. But as the geopolitical situation deteriorated in August 1939, the program shifted from a defensive contingency to something far more aggressive. What followed was a series of events that transitioned these icons of civilian life into gray ghosts ships stripped of their identity, painted in dull naval camouflage, and sent into the North Atlantic to perform tasks for which they were never designed. But even as the conversion began, a strange pattern emerged. While some ships were being fitted with guns, others were being redirected to remote harbors, their crews dismissed, and their portholes welded shut. The first hint that something was amiss came in the final week of August. The RMS Rawalpindi, a 16,000-ton P&O liner, was suddenly recalled to port. There was no explanation given to the passengers, who were offloaded at the nearest available dock. Within 48 hours, her opulent furniture was being burned on the quayside or sold for scrap. This wasn't a standard naval requisition. It was a gutting. Historians have often puzzled over the speed of these conversions. The Admiralty was moving with a sense of urgency that suggested they knew something the public did not. But it wasn't just about speed. It was about the nature of the ships themselves. Large liners were notoriously difficult to protect. They were soft targets, huge, fast, but incredibly fragile if hit below the waterline. And yet, the Admiralty began sending them into the most dangerous waters of the Atlantic, often without escorts. This has led some to question the strategic logic of the time. Why risk the pride of the British merchant fleet in roles that traditionally belonged to destroyers or cruisers? Some historians believe the Admiralty was operating under a disposable fleet doctrine, a cold calculation that these ships, while valuable in peace, were essentially high-value decoys in the opening gambit of a total war. But that wasn't the strangest part of the 1,939 losses. As the first month of the war unfolded, a series of accidental sinkings and strategic scuttlings began to occur. In various ports across the UK and its territories, ships that had been requisitioned, but not yet armed, were found to be taking on water. In other cases, vessels were ordered to sea only to be scuttled in shallow channels. The official reason was often harbor defense or prevention of enemy capture. But the geography of these sinkings doesn't always align with the location of the German advance. In the archives of the Ministry of War Transport, there are references to Operation Lucid, a plan so sensitive that many of its details were destroyed after the war. The operation involved the use of aging or redundant luxury vessels as fire ships or block ships. However, the list of ships designated for this fate included vessels that were far from redundant. They were modern, capable liners. This suggests a disconnect between the public narrative of saving the fleet and the private reality of sacrificing it. What happened next began to shift the narrative entirely. On a cold October morning, the SS City of Mandalay was spotted drifting in the Atlantic, completely devoid of life. She wasn't a luxury liner in the sense of the Queen Mary, but she was a high-end passenger cargo hybrid. When naval boarding parties reached her, they found a ship in perfect working order. There was no sign of a struggle, no torpedo damage, and yet the lifeboats were gone. The ship was later sunk by a British destroyer to prevent her from becoming a navigational hazard. This incident was recorded as a standard loss due to U-boat activity, but the lack of a distress signal or any survivor testimony regarding an attack has left a lingering shadow over the official report. It was the first of the empty sinkings vessels that seemed to vanish or be abandoned under circumstances that defied the brutal logic of submarine warfare. There is no clear consensus on whether these early losses were the result of genuine German successes or a more complex internal strategy. Some researchers suggest that the Admiralty was intentionally clearing the boards, removing ships that would require too many resources to protect, or using them to test German U-boat positions. By late 1939, the Atlantic was a chessboard, and the luxury liners were the pawns being moved into the line of fire. But the most compelling evidence of a deeper plan lies in the Admiralty secret orders regarding the Scapa Flow defenses. Scapa Flow, the great naval base in the Orkney Islands, was the heart of the British fleet. After the daring raid by the German U-47, which sank the HMS Royal Oak in the very heart of the base, the Admiralty's panic reached a fever pitch. In the weeks that followed, several large merchant vessels and liners were ordered to the Orkneys. These ships weren't there to transport troops. They were there to die. The orders specified that they were to be filled with concrete and scuttled in the narrow channels to block any further submarine incursions. It was a logical military move, but the selection of the ships remains a point of contention. Among those slated for destruction were vessels that still had decades of service life left. The empty sinkings were no longer a mystery. They were a matter of official policy. And yet, as the divers moved in to set the charges on these majestic hulls, they discovered something that wasn't in the blueprints. Beneath the ballast of one particular liner, a ship that had only months earlier been the height of fashion, was a cargo that hadn't been recorded in any manifest. The cargo discovered beneath the concrete ballast was not the gold bullion many modern treasure hunters dream of. Instead, it was a vast cache of precision-engineered industrial machinery and optical equipment components that Britain desperately needed for its own war effort, yet were being sent to the bottom of the ocean along with the ships. This discovery, made by salvage teams decades later, adds a layer of confusion to the narrative. Why would the Admiralty scuttle a ship containing the very tools it needed to fight a war? Some historians suggest that the hurry to block the channels at Scapa Flow was so absolute that the bureaucracy of the Ministry of Supply simply couldn't keep up with the Admiralty's demands. Others believe these ships were never meant to stay at the bottom. They were underwater warehouses, cached in the shallow, cold waters of the Orkneys to protect them from Luftwaffe bombing raids that were devastating the shipyards of the Clyde and the Mersey. But if that was the case, the records of these caches were either lost or never written down. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In the Admiralty's Blue Books, the confidential logs of merchant requisitions, a series of entries from November 1000, 939 began to appear with a peculiar notation, Condition Zulu. In naval parlance of the time, Zulu referred to a ship that was no longer considered a vessel, but a stationary asset. Yet, many of the ships marked Zulu were still actively sailing the North Atlantic. These were the 12 luxury liners that are the focus of our investigation. They were ships in limbo, officially recognized as stationary defense assets, yet physically moving through the most dangerous waters on Earth. To the men who crewed these vessels, the atmosphere was one of profound unease. One such man was Arthur Penhaligon, a junior radio officer on the SS California. In his private letters, he described the experience of sailing a 17,000-ton liner that had been stripped of its soul. The carpets were gone, the chandeliers had been replaced by bare bulbs protected by wire cages, and the silence in the empty passenger corridors was, in his words, deafening. Penhaligon wrote that the ship felt like a ghost before it had even sunk. The crew was reduced to a skeleton staff, barely enough to keep the boilers running and the bridge manned. They were under strict orders to maintain radio silence, even if they spotted a U-boat. The mission was never explained to them. They were simply told to sail to specific coordinates in the mid-Atlantic and wait. And that's when things began to shift. On the 23rd of November, 1939, the HMS Rawalpindi, now acting as an armed merchant cruiser, encountered the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. The Rawalpindi was a passenger liner with guns bolted to her deck. She stood no chance against the steel giants of the Kriegsmarine. She was blown apart in a matter of minutes. While the Rawalpindi's end was a documented act of war, it served a purpose for the Admiralty that went beyond the loss of a ship. It provided a cover. In the chaos following the engagement, several other liners in the vicinity, ships that were not armed and carried no passengers, were reported missing. The official records simply listed them as lost to enemy action, bundled into the same report as the Rawalpindi. But modern analysis of German U-boat logs from that specific week reveals a startling discrepancy. The German commanders, who were notoriously meticulous in recording their kills for propaganda purposes, made no mention of these other vessels. If the Germans didn't sink them, and they didn't return to port, where did they go? There is no clear consensus, but some researchers have pointed to a secret directive known as Plan R. This plan involved the creation of decoy convoys. The idea was to send empty, high-profile liners into known U-boat hunting grounds to draw the submarines away from the real convoys, the ones carrying vital food and ammunition from America. These liners were essentially bait, and their crews were the involuntary participants in a deadly game of misdirection. The sacrifice of these ships was a cold, mathematical necessity in the eyes of the High Command. A liner like the SS Transylvania, with its massive silhouette, was much easier for a U-boat commander to spot than a low-slung freighter. By sacrificing one liner, the Admiralty might save 10 freighters. But the cost was more than just steel and steam. It was the erasure of the peak of maritime achievement. By December 1939, the pattern of empty sinkings had reached its peak. Reports began to surface of stationary lights in the middle of the Atlantic, vast illuminated shapes that appeared on the horizon and then vanished. These are now believed to have been the last of the luxury liners, ordered to sail with full lights on a direct violation of blackout protocols to act as the ultimate lures. What those crews felt, standing on the decks of these brightly lit targets in the middle of a pitch-black ocean, is almost impossible to imagine. They were waiting for a torpedo that they knew was coming, on a ship that the government had already written off as a loss. It was a psychological war of nerves, and for some, the tension was too much to bear. Records suggest that at least 2 of these vessels were scuttled by their own crews rather than waiting for the enemy to do it. The SS Dunera, for instance, reported a sudden internal explosion that sent her to the bottom in minutes. While the official report blamed a U-boat, The damage patterns later analyzed by maritime forensic experts suggested the charges were set from the inside, near the seacocks. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the first year of the war drew to a close, a document surfaced in the personal papers of a mid-level Admiralty clerk. It was a list of vessels consumed. In the ledger, the 12 liners weren't listed by their names, but by their insurance value. The document outlined a plan to use the massive insurance payouts from these war losses to fund the rapid construction of a new type of vessel, the Flower-class corvette. This has led to a controversial interpretation of the 1,939 losses. Some historians believe the Admiralty didn't just sacrifice these ships for tactical reasons, but for financial ones. The luxury liners were relics of a peacetime economy that no longer existed. They were expensive to maintain, impossible to fuel in a shortage, and a liability to protect. By losing them to the enemy, the state could liquidate these assets and turn them into the specialized warships it actually needed. Yet, this theory remains just that, a theory. There is no smoking gun, no single order that says, sink the liners for the money. What we have instead is a trail of breadcrumbs, empty ships, missing logs, and a series of coincidental sinkings that all occurred within a 4-month window. And then, there is the matter of the RMS Empress of Britain. While she survived 1,939, her treatment during those final months of peace mirrored the 12 that didn't make it. She was the largest ship sunk during the war, and her final voyage was shrouded in the same secret orders that governed the others. What her survivors reported seeing in the water around her just before she went down would change the understanding of the Admiralty's secrets forever. They saw not just lifeboats, but crates, thousands of them bobbing in the oily swells. Crates that were supposed to be in the hold of a ship that was officially listed as carrying no cargo. The crates bobbing in the water around the sinking Empress of Britain were not filled with industrial machinery or the personal effects of the crew. When a few were recovered by a passing destroyer, they were found to contain something far more mundane, yet far more revealing: thousands of sets of blank civilian mobilization forms and unissued rationing books. This discovery, tucked away in the footnotes of a naval salvage report, points to a reality that the Admiralty was loath to admit in 1939. The luxury liners weren't just being used as decoys or block ships, they were being used as floating administrative hubs. In the feverish weeks following the declaration of war, the British government was terrified that the knockout blow from the Luftwaffe would level London and destroy the machinery of state. The solution was to distribute that machinery, the records, the forms, the very bureaucracy of the British Empire across the fleet. But as the threat of invasion seemed to fluctuate, and as the reality of the U-boat menace became clear, these paper ships became liabilities. If a ship carrying the National Archives or the blueprints for mobilization were captured, the strategic damage would be catastrophic. It is here that the secret orders take their most chilling turn. There are historians who believe that some of the 12 liners were sunk not because they were empty, but because what they carried was too sensitive to be allowed to fall into enemy hands and too bulky to be moved in a hurry. In the logic of 1,939, it was better for a ship to be at the bottom of the Atlantic than in the hands of a German prize crew. What they found next in the archives changed the narrative of the MT-12 entirely. Among the decrypted signals from the German B-Dienst intelligence service, there are several intercepts from late 1939. The Germans were confused. Their reconnaissance pilots were reporting large liners sitting motionless in the North Sea, apparently abandoned. The German High Command suspected a trap, a Q-ship tactic, where a seemingly helpless merchant vessel would reveal hidden guns the moment a U-boat surfaced. This German hesitation may have been exactly what the Admiralty intended. By leaving these ships as ghosts on the horizon, they created a psychological barrier. The German Navy, wary of a repeat of the sophisticated traps of the First World War, became overly cautious. This caution bought the British weeks of time to organize the first true convoys. But for the men left on those ships, the experience was a descent into a waking nightmare. One of the few survivors of the empty fleet, a stoker named Elias Thorne, gave a deposition in 1946 that was immediately classified. He described being part of a maintenance crew of 12 men on a ship designed for 3,000. They were ordered to keep the fires lit and the smoke pouring from the funnels to give the illusion of a fully crewed ship. Thorne's account describes the haunting atmosphere of the empty first-class dining saloon, where the crew would eat their meager rations on the floor because the furniture had been bolted into crates and moved to the lower decks. He spoke of the secret orders that were kept in a weighted bag on the bridge, to be thrown overboard the moment another ship was sighted, regardless of whether that ship was friend or foe. And that's when things began to shift. Thorne's deposition mentioned a specific date, the 14th of December 1939. His ship, the SS Laurentic, was shadowed by an unidentified vessel for 3 days. No signals were exchanged, no shots were fired. On the 4th day, the Laurentic received a wireless burst in a code the radio officer didn't recognize. Within the hour, the crew was ordered into the lifeboats. The ship was scuttled by internal charges. As they pulled away, Thorne claimed he saw the shadowing vessel move in toward the sinking liner. It wasn't a German U-boat. It was a British corvette. This raises a question that no official history has ever fully answered. Why was the Royal Navy sinking its own luxury fleet in the middle of a war for survival? The answer may lie in the tonnage replacement scheme, a complex financial agreement between the government and the great shipping lines like Cunard and White Star. The liners were aging, and the cost of converting them back to luxury service after a long war would have been astronomical. By ensuring these ships were lost early in the conflict, the shipping lines could claim the maximum insurance value and, more importantly, a guaranteed slot in the post-war shipyards for new, modern vessels. But this wasn't the strangest part of the financial trail. In the 1970s, a researcher looking into the Bank of England's wartime gold movements discovered a series of transfers that didn't align with the known shipments to Canada. The transfers were tied to the names of several liners that had officially been sunk empty in 1939. Records suggest that some of these ships were carrying private wealth, the assets of wealthy European families fleeing the Nazi advance. This wealth was unmanifested, handled entirely through private channels within the Admiralty. If these ships were indeed carrying unrecorded fortunes, their accidental or strategic sinkings take on a much darker hue. There is no clear consensus, but the persistent rumors of gold ships in the deep Atlantic continue to draw the attention of deep-sea salvage firms today. Yet, as we look back from the perspective of the 21st century, the most enduring mystery isn't the gold or the insurance money. It's the silence. For over 80 years, the families of the merchant sailors who went down with these empty ships have been told a story of German aggression. But the archives tell a story of a government playing a desperate, cold-blooded game of chess. The 12 liners were more than just ships. They were the physical manifestation of a world that was being systematically dismantled. The Admiralty's secret orders were the blueprint for that dismantling. They knew that to win the war, they had to sacrifice the symbols of the peace. The mirrors, the mahogany, and the velvet had no place in the world that was coming. Today, the wrecks of these 12 vessels lie in some of the most inaccessible parts of the ocean. Most have never been visited by a camera or a diver. They remain as they were in 1939, silent, empty, and stripped of their names. Some historians believe that the full truth of the Admiralty secret orders is still locked away, protected by the 100-year rule that governs the most sensitive state secrets. Until those files are opened in 2039, we are left only with the fragments, the empty corridors, the unmanifested crates, and the testimony of men like Elias Thorne. The sinking of the 12 luxury liners remains a haunting chapter in maritime history, a reminder that in the shadow of total war, the line between friend and foe, between protection and sacrifice, becomes impossibly thin. What really happened in the winter of 1939 remains one of the Atlantic's most guarded secrets, resting in the rust and the silt 3 miles down. The ocean rarely gives up its ghosts, and in the case of the Admiralty's empty 12, it seems the ghosts were never meant to be found.